Resuming debate, the honourable member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill C-24 is an interesting bill. It ostensibly sets out to address a gender wage gap in Cabinet by doing two things: changing or eliminating the current title of Minister of State to Minister, and then paying all ministers the same salary. It also creates 3 new placeholder cabinet positions to be filled and defined at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. This bill will also remove the heads of regional economic development agencies from the Salaries Act, which means that while ministers could still be the head of a regional development agency, the head of such agency would not necessarily be styled as a minister. At first blush, this bill seems innocuous and maybe laudable. However, upon closer examination, this bill raises some important questions which we hope the government will be able to answer. The first question is, why is this bill necessary? There are currently 2 levels or tiers of ministers. Full regular ministers are heads of their respective departments, such as the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Defence, the Minister of Immigration. All of these happen to be men. And the second tier or level of ministers, also called previously Ministers of State, now had their name changed, have the title of minister, but the responsibilities are unchanged. We have the Minister of Science, the Minister responsible for the status of women, the Minister of Sports and Persons with Disability, all of whom happen to be women. And while science, the status of women, and sports and persons with disability are all important, historically these matters have not been accorded the same status or level of responsibility or scope of mandate as finance, defence, and immigration. And in fact, the Minister of State designation has been seen largely as a post of more of a junior minister. I'd like to share with my colleagues one definition. A Minister of State is a cabinet minister, a more junior cabinet minister in the Canadian cabinet, and is usually given specific responsibilities to a senior cabinet minister in a specific area. While it is a noble goal to achieve gender parity in cabinet, as it is in all things, the way that this is done also has to be fair, equitable, defendable, and transparent. When the newly minted cabinet was sworn in last year, it was heralded and greeted with much enthusiasm, and there were lots of congratulations to go around. But then a news story revealed that there were 15 men, and 15 women in the new cabinet. 5 of the women, none of the men, were actually assigned to be ministers of state. And those 5 ministers are the Minister of Science, who would work and report to the Minister for Innovation, Science and Economic Development, the Minister of Small Business and Tourism, who would also work for the Innovation Minister, the Status of Women Minister, who would work under the Heritage Minister, the Minister of Sport and Persons with Disability, who would also work under the Heritage Minister, and the Minister for La Francophonie, who would support the Foreign Affairs Ministry. A senior government spokesperson clarified that these ministers of states are already considered full ministers, and that all that remained was for the government to change the Treasury Board statute to reflect this new development. But she also said that, and I quote, "Making these 5 women full ministers does not mean their portfolios will take on the size and scope of full departments. They are serviced by other departments in the same way they have always been, but they have the full standing and authority of any other minister around the cabinet table." Mr. Speaker, I believe the cabinet should reflect our society, and 50% women ministers is great. But if 5 of those women ministers are in effect junior ministers appointed to assist full ministers, then is there really truly a cabinet of equals? 3 of the 5 junior ministers would be assisting their male ministers. This bill then aims to bump up the salaries of these junior ministers to the same level as full ministers, despite these ministers not having a full ministry or department to oversee, nor the scope. So is this fair? Is it equitable to have equal pay for unequal work, scope, and responsibility? Is this a case of pay equity? Or is this bill just a way for the government to make good on their claim of gender parity in Cabinet. This is not to say that paying women more and fairly is a bad thing. In fact, the NDP has been fighting for pay equity for decades. Canadian women have been fighting for and waiting for pay equity for a very long time. Pay equity, as my honourable colleagues know, was established as a fundamental human right in 1977. And since then, working women in Canada have had unequal success and being paid fairly. Some provincial jurisdictions have established pay equity commissions, and the women in those jurisdictions are enjoying a modicum of equality with their male colleagues when it comes to equal pay for work of equal value. I'm sad to say, however, that too many working women are still waiting this day. On Wednesday, the government tabled its response to the report of the Special Committee on Pay Equity, announcing that it recognized that pay equity is a human right. In fact, the report of the committee was entitled, "It's Time to Act." Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the government clearly doesn't believe it is time to act. Instead, it announced that notwithstanding that pay equity is a human right, Canadian women will have to wait another 2 years before this government introduces legislation, let alone implement it. I had the privilege of serving on that special committee, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you that expert witnesses testified that there is no reason to wait. There was broad consensus among all witnesses that pay equity is a human right and should not be subject to collective bargaining, that the current complaint-based system is not acceptable to everyone, is not accessible, to everyone, is costly and time-consuming for those who do have access, and effectively is denying fairness and justice through the delays that can stretch for decades. As some people know, some women have died before they were able to get their pay equity settlement. Canadian women have been waiting too long for the right to pay equity to be realized, and there shouldn't be any more delays. We need proactive pay equity legislation to achieve pay equity, obviously, and the 2004 Task Force report provides an excellent template for that legislation. Some of my colleagues in this House will remember that the 2004 Task Force on Pay Equity conducted an extensive review of this issue, and that report, their report, has been recognized internationally as one of the most comprehensive and authoritative work on pay equity that has ever been done. The task force consulted widely and produced a list of recommendations that are still relevant and valid. In 2005, the Standing Committee for the Status of Women studied this report, and at that time asked the then Liberal government of the day to introduce legislation immediately. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and regrettably, this Liberal government has also decided to punt ahead. Mr. Speaker, I cannot fully express my profound disappointment with the cynicism that this government and these ministers have shown in their response to the committee report. Asking Canadian women to wait another 2 years is unconscionable, and committing to bringing in legislation in 2018, just prior to election, is a shameful ploy to hold the rights of working women ransom. It's like saying, yes, we acknowledge that you have a right to equal pay for work of equal value and it's been neglected, and although we have the power to fix this injustice right away, we won't. We will make lofty claims about being a feminist government and will promise to bring in legislation in a couple of years, just in time for you to vote us in again so we can actually do what we should and could have done right now. This government is asking women to just endure 2 more years of being paid approximately 70 cents for every dollar of their male counterparts. That's 30% less buying power for women to spend in the economy. It's 30% less to pay for rent, for food, for childcare, for education, to invest in their pensions. It's even worse for women who are from Indigenous or racialized communities and those living with disabilities. This inequality contributes to a much lower standard of living for women, and its effects are brought forward to the next generation. As Kate McInturf, one of the learned witnesses who appeared before the committee, testified, Today in Canada, our daughters are as likely to attend university as our sons, but we are in danger of failing to deliver on the promise of education because those girls will grow up and graduate to a pay gap unless we act now. Karma doesn't cut it. Doing nothing, leaving pay to the forces of the market gives us what we have today, a widening gap between men's and women's rates of pay. Let me repeat that. The gap in men's and women's full-time wages is growing right now in Canada, not shrinking. End of quote. I asked Dr. McInturf if she agreed that pay equity legislation is an important step to eliminating the gender wage gap, that we shouldn't have to wait to get everything right, that we could actually start and have an impact on women's lives if we had, at the very least, federal pay equity legislation. And this was her response. Well, yes, clearly I think we need to act sooner than later. But really, when we're talking about life-threatening impact, we have to think about the women who make up two-thirds of minimum wage workers. A pay gap for a retail worker who is making $12,000 to $13,000 a year can really mean the difference between food and rent or not. That's why I would urge the committee to act on this, because addressing it has really substantial impact on the quality of life of the lowest earning women in Canada, end quote. So when we consider Bill C-24, which will add $20,000 to the salaries of some of the highest earning women in Canada, I really do need to wonder about the priorities of this government. This bill will adjust the wages and put it into the Act of 5 of the most well-paid women in Canada, and the legislation was drawn up very quickly and brought to the House so we could pass it. But millions of working women in Canada who earn far less are being told they have to wait for their wages to be adjusted. Where is the fairness, Mr. Speaker? Bill C-24 appears to be a cosmetic fix to a problem created by the Prime Minister. Claims of a truly gender-equal cabinet were trumpeted far and wide, but when it was pointed out that some of the women, and only women, who made up this gender-balanced cabinet were actually junior ministers being paid at a junior minister's salary level, the government had to do some damage control, and this bill is the result. This bill, unfortunately ignores the clear difference in responsibility conferred to women in the Prime Minister's cabinet. If the Prime Minister truly believes in and wants to equalize the status of government ministers, as this bill purports to do, then all he needs to do is appoint an equal number of men and women as full ministers and an equal number of men and women as ministers of state. It seems simple enough. There's no need to mess with salary levels or artificially inflating the salaries of junior ministers in order to elevate them to the status of full ministers. Interestingly, though, all of the 5 ministers of states who will see a $20,000 raise with the passage of this bill, appointed by the Prime Minister, are women. It would almost seem as though the junior minister positions were not good enough for men. But the Liberal approach to fixing a problem of their own making is counterproductive because it ignores the principles of pay equity, equal pay for work of equal value, and equal opportunity to perform roles with higher responsibility. Real gender parity in cabinet means appointing an equal number of women to be department heads or full ministers. By papering pretty well over the distinction between ministers of states and full ministers, the Prime Minister is prioritizing the equality of compensation over the equality of responsibility with respect to gender parity in his government. I would respectfully submit, Mr. Speaker, that observing the principles of pay equality and equal opportunity is the appropriate way to eliminate the gender pay gap that currently was existing in Cabinet. The second area of concern in this bill is the removal of the heads of the regional economic development agencies from the Salaries Act. This means that while different ministers could still be heads of the various agencies, No one could be a minister simply by virtue of being the head of a regional economic development agency. Again, it sounds innocuous, but what this really amounts to is the somewhat neutering of these agencies. Canadians value the contribution of these agencies to their economic development, and these regions are best served by having someone with local expertise at the helm of the respective agencies. Bill C-24 will diminish the role of the regional economic development ministers around the cabinet table, and at present rolls them up under the purview of the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. How does it make sense that 6 diverse economic development portfolios representing 6 different geographical regions be grouped under one minister? You know, when you visit the Government of Canada's website for regional development agencies across Canada, this is what it states. Regional development agencies across Canada help to address key economic challenges by providing regionally tailored programs, services, knowledge, and expertise that build on regional and local economic assets and strengths, support business growth, productivity, and innovation, help small and medium-sized businesses effectively compete in the global marketplace, provide adjustment assistance in response to economic downturns and crises, and support communities. Each regional development agency brings a regional policy perspective in support of the national agenda through regional economic intelligence to support national decision-making, contributing to federal regional coordination and cooperative relationships with other levels of government, community and research institutions and other stakeholders, and supporting national priorities in those regions. Getting rid of regional oversight and autonomy of these economic development agencies is another example of top-down government. But perhaps this is just another step towards placing these agencies on the chopping block. In the past, the agencies had full-time ministers or ministers of state, or the portfolio was attached to a specific minister from the region who carried other cabinet responsibilities. Federal agencies directly deliver and administer hundreds and millions of dollars to help spur on regional economic development. For example, ACOA, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, which was the first agency created by the federal government, had a budget last year of $298.6 million. And its former president has publicly mused that, and I quote, "The future of these agencies could be in peril without having permanent ministers advocating on their behalf. This is going to be low-hanging fruit. It is a lot tougher to abolish an agency that has a minister, particularly if that is the minister's only job, than it is to abolish an agency that is essentially an agency of public servants." So I wonder what the real intent is for regional development agencies. Would it be helpful for members, as well as the people in those regions, to learn what the government's plan is for the future of economic development in their areas? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the third area of concern I have is that Bill C-24 gives the Prime Minister the ability to add 3 new or additional ministers at his discretion without giving us an idea of what those positions might be or who might occupy them. It seems like another example of this government, despite its promises of transparency and open government, setting up another avenue to be able to do just what it wants without proper or any oversight. In the spirit of transparency and accountability, I invite the government to tell the House exactly what these positions would be. Members can then make an informed decision. In summary, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-24 presents more questions than answers, and I hope that the government will see fit to be more forthcoming about the details and the intended consequences of this bill in the days to come. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.